The winter of 1942 to 43 became the fulcrum of Hitler's undoing. In Stalingrad, the 6th Army, once considered unstoppable, found itself encircled by Soviet forces in a meticulously executed pincer movement. General Friedrich Paulus, facing starvation, frostbite, and constant bombardment, pleaded for relief. Hitler refused. The city's ruins echoed with the cries of dying men. The frozen bodies of soldiers scattered among shattered factories and burned-out tanks. Weeks stretched into months. Attempts to break the encirclement failed, and by February 1943, the surrender of 91,000 troops marked not just a military catastrophe, but a profound psychological blow to the German army and the nation itself. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps faced relentless pressure from British and American forces. The tide turned decisively at El Alamein in late 1942. Supply lines across the desert, already fragile, collapsed under sustained Allied attacks. Rommel's tactical ingenuity could not overcome the strategic reality. A German army fighting on multiple, distant fronts without sufficient reinforcements or logistical support. Axis forces retreated across Libya, leaving behind tanks, artillery, and thousands of exhausted men. Even in the skies, the balance was shifting. Allied bombers, flying over Germany and occupied Europe, increasingly dominated the air. Precision and saturation raids targeted industrial centers, rail networks, and fuel depots. German pilots, though skilled, faced overwhelming numbers and dwindling resources. The very air superiority that had enabled blitzkrieg in France was eroding, leaving German ground forces exposed and vulnerable. These events converged to reveal a central truth. Hitler's earlier successes have been the product of speed, surprise, and coordination, but the war's momentum had irrevocably shifted. Every decision, every overextended line, every frozen supply depot became a tangible marker of impending collapse. Soldiers, generals, and civilians alike began to sense that the war was no longer winnable. The cracks that had formed in strategy and leadership now widened into chasms. The stage was set for the final turning points of the war, events that would seal Hitler's fate across Europe, from Normandy's beaches to the streets of Berlin itself. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy became the stage for Hitler's most critical failure. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Western Europe, unfolded with precision and overwhelming force. Thousands of ships, planes, and soldiers struck across 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. German defenses, though formidable, were fragmented by poor communication, Hitler's delayed orders, and the inability to maneuver reserves effectively. Tanks arrived too late, artillery fell short, and the Atlantic Wall, once thought impenetrable, crumbled under relentless assault. Simultaneously, the Eastern Front was under relentless pressure. Soviet forces, having absorbed the lessons of earlier defeats, launched massive offensives across Ukraine and Belarus. Operation Bagration, in summer 1944, annihilated Army Group Center. Encirclements, ambushes, and coordinated attacks destroyed German divisions that had been considered elite. Cities fell, rail networks were severed, and the German army began a retreat that became increasingly chaotic and desperate. Hitler, isolated in his Führer bunker, continued to issue rigid directives. Withdrawal orders were ignored. Armies were commanded to stand fast in hopeless positions. Field marshals pleaded for tactical flexibility, but ideology and ego prevailed. Morale collapsed, and disobedience became both a symptom and a necessity for survival. By late 1944, Germany was fighting a defensive war on 2 massive fronts, with depleted resources and an air force incapable of challenging the Allies. The final months saw a series of desperate offensives and retreats. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble in December 1944, initially created confusion among Allied forces, but ultimately failed due to fuel shortages, logistical mismanagement, and overwhelming Allied superiority. Soviet forces continued their relentless advance from the east, capturing Warsaw, entering Hungary, and pressing toward Berlin. Every decision reinforced the inevitability of defeat. By early 1945, Germany was a nation encircled, its cities bombed, its army shattered, and its leader increasingly detached from reality. The combination of failed offensives, overextension, resource depletion, and Allied coordination made the collapse not just probable, but certain. Hitler's empire, once the epitome of military might, was crumbling under the weight of its own ambitions. The scene was now set for the aftermath, the reckoning of human costs, political consequences, and the irreversible shift in the world order. May 1945. Germany lay in ruins. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin were leveled by relentless Allied bombing. Streets that once thrummed with civilian life were now rubble-strewn and silent, save for the cries of the wounded and the scavenging of the desperate. The human toll was staggering. Estimates suggest over 6 million German civilians perished due to bombing, starvation, or forced displacement, alongside millions of soldiers dead or missing. The surrender of Berlin in May 1945 marked the formal end of the Third Reich. Hitler was dead, having taken his own life in the Führer bunker, leaving behind a country shattered physically, morally, and psychologically. The unconditional surrender imposed by the Allies brought both relief and reckoning. German soldiers, once instruments of blitzkrieg, were now prisoners facing tribunals, forced labor, or repatriation under harsh conditions. Occupation divided the nation. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each controlled zones in Germany, implementing denazification programs and rebuilding civil administration from the ground up. Former officials, party members, and collaborators were subjected to trials that exposed the machinery of Nazi terror. Evidence of concentration camps, mass executions, and systemic atrocities shocked the world, laying bare the consequences of a regime built on ideology rather than humanity. Denied. Decisions were made through ideology rather than practicality, with devastating consequences. Across Europe, the Allies were learning and adapting. Britain rebuilt its air defenses, strengthened its navy, and trained forces for future landings on continental soil. In the Soviet Union, commanders like Zhukov and Vasilevsky reorganized armies, using intelligence, deep reserves, and mobility to blunt the German advance. Coordination between Allied nations grew, creating an increasingly unified opposition to Hitler's forces. By 1943, the war had entered a critical phase. Stalingrad had fallen into history as a symbol of German overreach and Soviet resilience. In North Africa, Axis forces were retreating under relentless pressure. And Hitler, obsessed with defending every inch of conquered territory, began to stretch his armies thinner than ever. Every victory that had once seemed decisive now came at an unsustainable cost. The broader strategic context was clear. Germany's initial successes had created illusions of invincibility, but the combination of overextension, harsh environments, resilient enemies, and flawed leadership had shifted the balance. The world that Hitler sought to dominate was now closing in on him from every direction. The moment of opportunity and impending collapse was approaching. The men on the front lines bore the weight of Hitler's ambitions. German soldiers, initially confident after the swift victories in Poland and France, now faced the grinding reality of war on multiple fronts. In the winter of 1942-43, frostbite, hunger, and relentless artillery defined daily life. Letters from home were scarce. Hope grew thin. At Stalingrad, entire regiments were trapped in ruins, forced to fight in sub-zero temperatures with dwindling ammunition. Psychological strain became as lethal as the enemy's bullets. Desert warfare in North Africa was no kinder. Sandstorms, sweltering heat, and extended supply lines tested endurance and morale. Soldiers questioned orders that seemed increasingly irrational, yet loyalty and fear kept them moving forward. Their fatigue, suffering, and dwindling numbers would be a decisive factor in Germany's ultimate failure. Leadership angle: Hitler's grip on command. Hitler's personal involvement in military decisions became a defining weakness. Once trusting his generals, he gradually assumed complete control, often overriding experienced commanders. Strategic withdrawals were forbidden. Requests for reinforcements were ignored. At Stalingrad, the army's encirclement might have been avoided had Hitler allowed a tactical retreat. In North Africa, Rommel's request for supplies clashed with Hitler's insistence on holding ground. The Führer's micromanagement, driven by ideology and obsession with glory, often turned advantage into disaster. Leadership at the highest level became inflexible, punishing initiative and rewarding obedience over reasoned judgment. Technological angle: innovation versus production limits. Germany's technological advances were formidable but insufficient against the Allies' industrial capacity. Tanks like the Tiger and Panther were superior in armor and firepower, yet they were expensive and slow to produce. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 dominated early air battles, but Allied numbers and improved tactics eroded this edge. Logistics lagged behind innovation. Fuel shortages, spare parts, and maintenance issues often grounded advanced machinery. In contrast, the Allies emphasized mass production, standardization, and supply chain efficiency. Superior German technology could not compensate for an overstretched army and dwindling resources. Even the most brilliant German strategies faltered under changing circumstances. Stalingrad, 1942-43, was more than a military defeat. It shattered the myth of invincibility. Encircled and starving, the Sixth Army's surrender marked the first time Hitler's forces were decisively beaten on the Eastern Front. On the Western Front, D-Day in June 1944 revealed the limits of Germany's defensive preparations. The Atlantic Wall, impressive on paper, could not repel the combined might of Allied land, sea, and air forces. Every tactical misstep, from delayed reinforcements to misjudged offensives, compounded the strain on already exhausted troops. Momentum, once the cornerstone of blitzkrieg, had vanished. Enemy angle: Allied resilience and coordination. Hitler's opponents adapted quickly. The Soviet Union rebuilt armies even after catastrophic losses, learning from early defeats to anticipate German strategies. The United States, entering the war in 1941, brought unparalleled industrial and logistical capacity, supplying weapons, vehicles, and food across continents. Britain, seasoned by the Battle of Britain, coordinated intelligence and special operations that consistently disrupted German operations. Allied cooperation created multiple fronts, stretching German forces thin. No longer facing isolated armies, Hitler now confronted a synchronized, determined global opposition capable of replacing losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Moral and ideological angle: overreach and brutality. Nazi ideology fueled expansion but undermined strategy. The obsession with racial hierarchy and resource plunder led to policies that alienated populations and consumed resources in ways that offered no military advantage. Brutal occupation tactics in the East fueled partisan resistance, tying down troops and supply lines. Ideological rigidity dictated strategy, even when pragmatism demanded otherwise. The insistence on holding territory, punishing civilians, and executing scorched earth policies revealed a regime more committed to doctrine than to winning the war. These moral failings directly translated into military disadvantage, as local populations resisted and international opinion turned firmly against Germany. Together, these angles, tactical, enemy, and moral, exposed the multifaceted reasons behind Hitler's failure. Strategic brilliance was countered by overreach, technological superiority was undermined by production limits, and ideology often blinded leadership to reality. January 1943. The bitter wind cuts across the frozen streets of Stalingrad. Smoke curls from shattered buildings, mingling with the acrid scent of burned oil and gunpowder. Soldiers huddle in the ruins, faces smeared with frost and grime, eyes hollow yet alert. Somewhere nearby, a German tank lies overturned, its tracks frozen in the icy mud. The Soviet artillery never ceases, hammering the city with relentless precision. On the other side, the German command scrambles for solutions, telegrams flying, radios crackling, voices tense with disbelief. Hunger gnaws at the men. Ammunition dwindles. Morale teeters on the edge. This city, once a symbol of industrial might, has become a trap. And as the winter deepens, so too does the realization. The tide of war is shifting. The forces that once seemed unstoppable now face a chain of failures. Strategic miscalculations, logistical nightmares, and a growing enemy that refuses to break. Here begins the story of Hitler's unraveling. A story not of a single battle, but of relentless overreach, misjudgment, and the unstoppable momentum of a world united against him. The cracks are forming, and soon they will become the chasms that no army, no ideology can bridge. By 1939, Adolf Hitler's Germany had reshaped the map of Europe. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had become the symbol of Nazi dominance. Poland fell in weeks. France, the supposed fortress of Western Europe, collapsed in a matter of days. Across the continent, German troops advanced with unprecedented speed, armored divisions and air support coordinated in deadly precision. Victory fed Hitler's confidence. The Wehrmacht, disciplined and well-equipped, seemed unstoppable. Meanwhile, the Allies struggled to respond. Britain, still reeling from the Dunkirk evacuation, prepared to defend its homeland against relentless Luftwaffe raids. The United States remained officially neutral, supplying aid from across the Atlantic while its own military prepared for a war that seemed distant. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond Europe's borders. Plans to invade the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, were drawn even before the dust had settled on France. Hitler's ideology, blending Lebensraum with racial fanaticism, demanded vast territories, natural resources, and subjugated populations. His generals warned that such a campaign would stretch supply lines across thousands of miles, over hostile terrain, against an enemy with immense manpower. Hitler dismissed these concerns. The Axis coalition, meanwhile, proved fragile. Italy struggled in North Africa, its campaigns stalling under British resistance. Japan's expansion in the Pacific diverted attention and resources from Europe. Germany's economy, although mobilized for war, could not sustain unlimited front lines. Factories churned out tanks, planes, and rifles, but logistical networks strained under the weight of fuel shortages, rail bottlenecks, and winterized equipment that never arrived in time. On the home front, the Nazi propaganda machine projected invincibility, masking the growing strain. Civilians endured rationing, air raids, and fear, yet morale remained superficially high. Soldiers, however, began to sense the limits of the Wehrmacht's reach. The initial victories, swift and decisive, had created a dangerous overconfidence. By the time the Wehrmacht reached the outskirts of Moscow in late 1941, the full scale of Germany's challenge became evident. Harsh Russian winter, fierce Soviet resistance, and extended supply lines combined to slow the advance. Where speed had once been Germany's advantage, attrition now became the enemy. Hitler's insistence on holding ground, rejecting tactical withdrawals, and micromanaging his commanders created tension at every level. Strategic miscalculations accumulated. In Stalingrad by January 1943, the consequences of these decisions crystallized. A trapped army, surrounded by Soviet forces, freezing in the ruins of a city it could not conquer. The stage was set. The German war machine, once thought invincible, now faced the first cracks of collapse. And across the Atlantic, the Allies were quietly reorganizing, preparing to exploit every weakness. The vastness of the Soviet Union would prove to be Germany's undoing. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had begun with astonishing success. Millions of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and air support rolling deep into Soviet territory. Cities fell, supply lines stretched, and Hitler's generals dared to hope for a quick victory. But the Soviets refused to collapse. Entire armies disappeared into the icy forests, only to re-emerge in counterattacks that struck deep into German flanks. Winter arrived early, brutal, and unforgiving. German troops, designed for rapid assault, were ill-prepared for sub-zero temperatures. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets. Tanks froze, artillery jammed, and supply convoys bogged down in mud and snow. The Red Army, though battered, adapted. Factories east of the Ural Mountains churned out tanks, planes, and rifles at an astonishing pace, replacing losses almost as quickly as they occurred. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the war tested Germany's ability to project power on multiple fronts. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, achieved remarkable successes against the British in Libya and Egypt. Yet, even his tactical brilliance could not overcome strategic limitations. Supply shortages, long desert supply lines, and the growing strength of the British Eighth Army. The Afrika Korps, though feared, remained dependent on fragile lines of communication stretching across the Mediterranean. Hitler's interference in operational command became a recurring pattern. On both the Eastern Front and in Africa, he imposed rigid directives, overruling generals who favored tactical flexibility. Strategic withdrawals, opportunities to regroup, and logistical adjustments were often. Economically, Germany was devastated. Industrial infrastructure lay in ruins, transportation networks were severed, and the agricultural system had collapsed. Rebuilding would take decades, aided in part by the Marshall Plan in the West, while the East fell under Soviet control, beginning the division that would define Europe for the next half-century. The psychological impact was profound. Survivors grappled with guilt, loss, and the trauma of witnessing the extremes of human cruelty and endurance. For the Allies, victory was tempered by the realization that defeating Hitler did not erase the cost of war. Entire generations had been scarred, societies transformed, and global politics irreversibly altered. The world, in both victory and horror, was left to confront the consequences of Hitler's ambition. And yet, even as the rubble cooled, lessons for the future began to crystallize. Lessons in strategy, ideology, human resilience, and the dangers of unbridled power. Beyond Germany's borders, the consequences of Hitler's defeat reshaped the global order. Europe lay divided, not just physically, but ideologically. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the Eastern Front, expanded its influence across Eastern Europe, establishing satellite states in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, Western Europe slowly rebuilt under the guidance and aid of the United States and Britain, setting the stage for a new geopolitical landscape, the Cold War. Militarily, the lessons were undeniable. Blitzkrieg, once revolutionary, had failed when overextended. Logistics and intelligence proved as critical as technology or firepower. The Allies' emphasis on mass production, coordination across land, sea, and air, and adaptation to changing conditions exposed the limits of rigid, ideologically driven command structures. Generals, scholars, and military strategists would study these campaigns for decades, extracting lessons about strategy, leadership, and the human costs of war. For the German people, the immediate aftermath was one of survival and reckoning. Refugees flooded the streets, starving civilians scavenged for food, and cities became vast, chaotic zones of displacement. Families searched for missing members. Entire communities were uprooted, and returning soldiers faced both shame and despair. Denazification programs sought to dismantle the ideological infrastructure, yet the psychological scars endured. The nation's identity had been reshaped by guilt, loss, and the challenge of rebuilding not just infrastructure, but moral and cultural foundations. Globally, Hitler's defeat reinforced the principle that no single ideology, no matter how militarily advanced, could dominate a coordinated world. Nations redrew boundaries, established international institutions like the United Nations, and began crafting a framework intended to prevent a repeat of such catastrophic conflict. Lessons in leadership, planning, and human resilience emerged as crucial guideposts for future generations. By 1945, the war had ended, but its echoes would last for decades. Hitler's ambitions, once sweeping across continents, had been halted not by chance, but by a combination of human resilience, strategic coordination, and the fatal flaws embedded in the Nazi system. The world had survived, yet it bore permanent reminders of both human ingenuity and the perils of unchecked power.